Hello and welcome to my podcast on the apocalypse. My name is Steve, and I want to share with you a story and a book because every book has a story behind it, and this one you may find interesting. The book cover is shown on my screen, and the name of the book is The Apocalypse, Letter by Letter, a literary analysis of the book of Revelation by Stephen Paul. The book dives into the literary devices used throughout the apocalypse, and the reason for that is to show you how to interpret the apocalypse for yourselves by giving you examples, because many people will tell you what it means and make assertions unsupported by the actual text, leaving you to wonder how the conclusions were reached. Let's first talk about the author of the book for a moment. Stephen Paul was much older than his sister, my wife. I met him at their parents' home for one of many family gatherings that they held over the years. He was a large man, about 6'2" and close to 300 pounds. Steve loved to talk and would always start into a discourse, a debate, or a discussion, depending on your point of view. Nearly every time it would turn to the apocalypse, and Steve would try his case with anyone who dared to challenge him. Steve would passionately quote from the Bible and from classic literature, history books, and books by church fathers such as St. Augustine, St. Thomas Aquinas, Tertullian, and others. As a casual Catholic by upbringing, I was astonished at the depth and breadth of the arguments. As time went by, I began to look forward to these oratories. I wondered how he knew so much about it. I found out that he had attended Our Lady Queen of Angels Seminary in the Los Angeles area, but then enlisted in the Marines and served in the Vietnam War. He picked the toughest unit he could find. While serving his country, he was diagnosed with cancer, probably from Agent Orange, an industrial strength version of Roundup used on the jungles of Vietnam. Surgery and chemotherapy saved his life, but required a long convalescence. Though given a short life expectancy, Steve beat the odds. During this period, Steve read many books, and literary analysis and the use of language became his passion. This influence will be evident in the book. He studied religion, history, and classic literature, and graduated magna cum laude from Boston University in 1974 with a Bachelor of Arts in English Language and Literature. Then in 1996, we got word that his cancer had recurred and he was undergoing chemotherapy. He seemed to be improving, but then disaster hit. While I was working as a consultant, about 3 hours drive from home in 1996, I received a message from my wife. She was shaken and had trouble explaining to me that her brother Steve had been brought to the hospital with a ruptured colon and was not expected to survive the day. He's not going to get out of this one, she said. Apparently, thinning of the intestinal walls is one complication from the cancer treatment. I jumped in the car for the 3 hour drive home with a deep sense of sadness and remorse. The nagging feeling in the back of my mind was what a waste it would be if the knowledge Steve had of the apocalypse and his faith were not passed on, especially to my children. So I began to pray, as my wife and children had been doing ever since Steve had become sick. I asked if that were possible, for with him all things are possible, to spare Steve so he could pass along what he knew about the apocalypse to my children, and they could in turn preserve it. Due to my weak faith, I assumed that this was folly, but there was nothing else I could do. I continued my drive and my conversation with the Lord. When I got home, I expected to be greeted with the news of Steve's passing, but instead was informed by my wife that he was hanging on by a thread. The doctors were in a dilemma. He was too weak to operate on and too sick not to. His vital signs were unstable. They decided to operate, and by some small miracle, he survived the night. The next few days, I watched the children while my wife and her family went to the hospital. They arranged for the sacrament of healing from a priest at the hospital. Steve was in a death grip. His face was contorted and pale. During the prayers for the sick, though, he changed. He took on a pinkish color, and his whole body seemed to relax. He lived. By one count, he had 14 IV bottles hooked up at once. Although he survived, he was mostly in a coma, and so after a week or so, I went back on the road to work. For 4 weeks, he lay in a coma, heavily sedated and with a tracheotomy tube. When I arrived home for the weekend, I decided to go see Steve with my wife. I felt really strange because it had been a while since I'd seen him, and I was afraid he wouldn't even recognize me. I was told he was so out of it that he wouldn't know much of anything. When I walked into the room, Steve motioned to me and kept trying to communicate. I asked if he knew who I was, and he smiled and nodded. He would get very frustrated because you can't talk with a tracheotomy tube. Then this 300-pound former Marine began to cry. I grabbed his hand and repeated over and over, "We're going to get through this. God has work for you." 4 days later, he was sitting up, taking short walks, and was talking. 2 days after that, he walked out of the hospital and went home. As he recovered, I told him how I had prayed that he would live so that he could write down what he knew about the apocalypse. At first, I think he thought I was crazy. Then the letters started coming, and I'll share my screen. And you can see them. Some in his own hand and some typewritten on an old manual typewriter. Steve had no use for technology. He still had a rotary phone in 1999. No computer, no cell phone. He was still driving a 1984 Ford Escort. First came a short letter that explained the symbols in the book of Daniel, and then how they will be important in interpreting the apocalypse. Then a beautiful letter, a commentary, and an introduction to the apocalypse followed. The letters kept coming. They kept getting more detailed and more beautiful. Because of Steve's medical history, he knew that his time was short to complete the task. He would stop by from time to time, armed with a box of Boston cream donuts, to explain some aspect of his letters. I kidded with him that he should never complete his commentary because then his mission would be over. His letters also changed during this time. He began to feel the strong hand of God in his work and began to see it as more than just letters for the family. He wrote, "When I look at what I have written, I am greeted by evidence of the grace of God, for some of the things explained have not been explained in 19 centuries. When I was young, I never thought I would write something like this. When it was all typed up, I will not even speculate on what God will do with it. I have not the foggiest idea. I only know I must finish it, and that is my cue to get back to the typing." And he started to give instructions on how it should be shared. In each letter, Steve showed how previous commentaries failed to let the grammar and structure of the apocalypse lead the reader to clues as to the symbols and sequence of events. This book is not a wildly speculative work of fancy or a fictional novel. It breaks little new ground, but rather echoes of traditions from the long past that may have been forgotten or dismissed. Where it does suggest something new, it is based on a detailed analysis, not speculation, and it can be quite mind-blowing. Steve also demonstrated how translators often imposed their own opinions into the text and distorted it from its original meaning in Greek. By meticulously giving examples from the original Greek text, the more reliable English translations, Steve showed how subtleties in the work answered the most vexing questions that have gone misunderstood or unexplained for 1800 years. At first, his methods may seem tedious, especially to the soundbite generation used to the paradigm of browsing as on the internet. This book appeals to the reader who is ready to apply their own reason and effort into evaluating the rational proofs presented. In some cases, the author challenges the reader to prove him wrong with their own explanations. He often advised us to use only the Bible as our main reference, though history books and writings by church fathers also prove helpful. I think it must have frustrated Steve that we would often tell him that what he wrote was very confusing for us. He often stated that the apocalypse was written in fourth grade grammar and anyone should be able to see what he saw. We told him we would try harder. Alas, he had only sent his analysis up to chapter 12, halfway through the apocalypse, when he got sick again and went to the hospital. While there, he implored me to complete it from his notes. As the reports from the hospital became more negative, I began to suspect this project would never be completed. I just didn't have the combination of intelligence, faith, and reason that Steve possessed. Usually we would go to visit Steve together on the weekend, but on a Thursday in October, I told my wife to go see him that day. I had a feeling the end was near. He was mostly unconscious, but for a few moments he opened his eyes. My wife told him that we were reading his work and were beginning to understand it. It was at this point that he mustered the strength to utter, "I understand now." It reminded me of the last words of St. Thomas Aquinas. All I've written is straw. The next morning, he was in God's arms. He was 54 when he died. I was deeply saddened, not only the loss of someone who had become like my own brother, but also by the fact that our mutual project had not been completed. In the drive to the funeral, I said to the family that we could be comforted that Steve's works will accompany him, as it says in the Apocalypse. My children, referred in the book as friends, and the principal recipients of the letters, served on the altar and performed the scripture readings at the funeral. One of the readings, selected by the presiding priest, who was unaware of Steve's work in this regard, was from the Apocalypse, chapter 14, verses 12 and 13. Here is what sustains the holy ones who keep God's commandments and their faith in Jesus. I heard a voice from heaven say, "Write this, blessed are the dead who die in the Lord from now on." Yes, said the Spirit, let them find rest from their labors, for their works accompany them. After the funeral, we went to his house, and there in the typewriter, a manual typewriter, was another page. I had no idea how many pages he may have finished that he hadn't sent. When his wife sent me 6 more pages, that got me most of the way through chapter 13. I again thought the project was over. Then a month later, my wife sent me a message at work. Guess what showed up in the mail today? I had no idea. She answered a package from Steve's wife, 68 pages of his notes. They weren't just notes. He had written out the entire commentary prior to sitting at that manual typewriter day after day. His wife had copied it for me and was fixing places where the copier had cut off parts of words. I was filled with such joy that all I could think of was typing the whole thing into a computer so that it could be shared. I completed editing the book around 2002, then sat on it and prayed about it until one day in 2006, while I was walking around the house, I got what felt like an interlocution. The words, "It's time," came to me, and I felt it meant it was time to publish the book, and so I did. The book will cover the time from the late 1st century when St. John wrote the Apocalypse to a time yet unknown in the future, and show how some of predicted events affecting God's people have come to pass, such as the Arian heresy, the barbarian invasions, the rise of Islam, the Greek schism, Martin Luther, and Protestantism. Each of these events then sets the table, so to speak, for the climactic events of the second and third woes. The book was written beginning in 1997, and Steve finished the letters in 2000. He did not live to see the attack on the World Trade Center, the invasions of Iraq and Afghanistan, the sex abuse scandal in the church, the death of Pope John Paul II, and the elections of Pope Benedict XVI and Pope Francis. Other events that would have piqued his interest include the accelerated de-Christianization of Europe and unregulated Islamic immigration, the riots in France, and the recent pronouncements from the Vatican. As you read the book, it should become clear how they all fit with what he wrote. He takes you through the most well-known figures, the 7 letters to the churches, the 4 horsemen, the 4 living beings, the 24 elders, the crystal sea, the beast rising from the sea, the beast rising from the earth, the Antichrist, the false prophet, the woman clothed with the sun, the great harlot, and much more. Steve once related to my wife that when he was sick as a young soldier, he was walking along a beach in Vietnam and spotted a lone seagull circling overhead. At that moment, he says he was infused with the certainty that everything is exactly the way it is supposed to be. What follows is the result of a life's work. It is Steve's Apocalypse, letter by letter. You can order the book from the website, apocalypseletterbyletter.com, or from Amazon. The website has a discount code at the top that makes it much cheaper to buy it there. The next podcast will be about Steve's first letter on the book of Daniel, chapters 2, 7, and 8. And then we'll look at chapter 1 of the Apocalypse. From there, we'll jump around a bit because I want to introduce the idea that the order of the chapters in the Apocalypse are not necessarily the order of the sequence of events in history. Oh, and I've collected some reviews over the years from different websites. Here are a few that are down below here, including Matt Abbott, a Catholic author, and then just people who said that the book changed their life. Thanks for watching and listening to this podcast, and I hope to see you again as we roll through the Apocalypse letter by letter.